Chapter 25. A Honeymoon in Brighton Beach. I don't know how to swim. There was little Gustavo and Damianos could do when Dan decided to take his young bride away for the weekend to Brighton Beach. The couple wanted to be away from overbearing parents, talkative aunts and uncles, and a whole slew of cousins. They wanted to spend a couple of days in each other's company before they would board the transatlantic liner bound to South America in the coming week. If one has never been to Brighton Beach, it could be described as San Francisco's ancestor, with its promenade being reminiscent of the famous Boardwalk in California. In 1902, however, the people and entertainment booths and fairground along the Palace Pier were much more sedate than those one might find these days along the North American beaches. Bianca was truly excited about everything. She enjoyed the horror house so much that when people in the moving cart behind them were screaming in terror of the figures and puppets suddenly appearing in front of them, Bianca would explode in nervous giggles. She was definitely aware of her surroundings. She was not to be fooled with puppets on strings or a bunch of fake cobwebs together with dried-up old skulls. "Didn't you enjoy this?" she asked Dan, noticing the frown crossing his brow as the two came out of the fairground ride. "Of course I did, Bianca, but I'm a little surprised by your reactions. Doesn't anything frighten you? These puppets and skulls, even if not real, would conjure up horrible images in anyone's mind, but not in yours." "It's not like that, Generoso. When I see things that are strange, I get a nervous reaction. I giggle, but I also don't let my mind play frightful tricks on me. I have an average imagination, as everyone does, I suppose, but I don't let those panoplies influence me." She stopped walking and turned to Dan. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I've never seen a few horrible things in my life, and I guess laughing or giggling in the ride was an automatic reaction. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you." Dan grabbed his wife's hand and said, "I don't think you would be capable of embarrassing me, dear girl. You surprised me, that's all. Anyway, let's not talk about that and see if we can find a restaurant where we can watch people going down the water." This time it was Dan's turn to erupt in laughter. "You mean you only want to watch? You don't want to go swimming?" They resumed walking in silence for a minute. Then Bianca bowed her head and murmured, "I don't know how to swim." Dan bent his head to look at her. "Don't be ashamed, Bianca. Lots of people don't know how to swim. It's not a crime." "But it is. I could not save my children if they were drowning." "Come on, Bianca. If it concerns you that much, as soon as we get to Rio Archer, I will teach you to swim." Dan stopped, turned to his wife, took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead. "As for our children, I will personally make sure they will all learn how to swim." "That's exactly what I thought my father or my mother would have done when I was little, but my mother doesn't like the beach or ocean." "And you lived in a city bordering the water. That's a bit strange, isn't it?" "Oh, well, yes. All my school friends would go to the beach during the holidays, but my parents would take me up mountain instead." They fell silent for a moment. Dan realized, and not for the first time either, how controlling his mother-in-law was. Everyone had to march to her own drum. He knew he would have to cut that umbilical cord as soon as they arrived in South America. "Listen to me, Bianca. I cannot teach you to swim in the 2 days we're here, but I will as soon as we're home, our home. I will buy a house for us, and we will raise our family the way we want. Your mother is a wonderful person, but it is time for you to leave the nest." Bianca lowered her gaze and nodded. "I know, Generoso, and having our own place is what I want too, but I don't want to cut my parents out of my lives either." She looked up, searching for her husband's approval. "Of course we won't do that, and I promise you I will be so tactful about it. You'll be proud of me in the end." "I guess you know how to be diplomatic, you being an advocate." Dan had to smile. He was not particularly fond of lawyers, but in this instance he felt proud of being called an advocate. He thought of his ancestor, Arnaldo Ricciulli once again, the man who wrote a treatise nearly 600 pages long centuries ago, advocating the righteousness of the Church's tenets. "I suppose you're right, dearest, and I'll apply all my expertise to make the break from your parents as pleasant as possible." He paused and stopped, walking in front of a nice hotel fronting the Promenade. "Do you think this terrace restaurant is close enough to the beach for you to watch the bathers?" "Now don't mock me, Generoso, but yes, this will do just fine, thank you." Not far from them, sitting at a neighbouring table, 2 gentlemen dressed in elegant linen suits were observing the couple without making it too obvious. "Why do you want to spy on them?" Gustavo asked Damianos, as he put his refreshing summer cocktail down on the table. "I can't leave Dan alone. I might lose him. Remember what happened to his son? I lost sight of Daniel for only half an hour, and he almost lost his life." "Yes, but Dan is not an irresponsible boy, is he?" No, but he is still brash and thirsty for adventure. He wants to show Bianca some of the pleasurable entertainment they can enjoy together. You see, Gustavo, although Regina described her daughter as a tomboy, always thirsty for adventure, Bianca has really lived a sheltered life. She travelled once a year to visit her grandmother in Spain, but that was the extent of her experience outside of home. In Rio Archa, she went to school and then spent the major part of the summer holidays with her parents in the Andes to escape the city heat or the overcrowded beaches. And now you're afraid that Dan's going to go overboard with showing her everything the young woman missed, is that it? Yes, I'll give you an example. Bianca has never learned how to swim, but he's going to take us sailing. Well, are you going to stop him? No, Gustavo, I can't. It's part of Dan's past life and I cannot change the past, remember? Why would he do something like that anyway? They're two peas in a pod, Gustavo. Bianca is thirsty for freedom and Dan is unable to bridle his desire for exhilarating experiences. Will they have an accident or something bad will happen to them? Gustavo was getting worried. He would have liked to go and whisper in Dan's ear to stop this nonsense immediately. We'll just have to wait and see. Damianos had been right. By mid-morning the next day, the young couple had rented a very nice sailboat from the local broker, and the two of them were well on their way for a morning of sailing. Bianca didn't want to show her fear, but she was petrified. If walking on the beach close to dying waves frightened her, being surrounded by water truly terrified her. The boat owner had urged both of them to wear their life jackets, and only left enough fuel in the canister for an hour's round trip, if they needed to use the motor. Generoso was an expert sailor. He had learned the ropes, so to speak, with his uncle in Salerno when he was very young. The departure from port was fine. The breeze was just strong enough to drive the sailboat along the shore at a very pleasant speed. Bianca was slowly feeling more confident and was beginning to relax a little when a sudden gust of wind sent the vessel in a sweeping move toward the open ocean. Dan lowered the sail in a swift and expert move, only to notice that his wife being unable to hold on to the railing well enough and, a moment later, being literally projected into the waves. Horrified, Dan didn't wait. He dove after his wife and swam with her in the crook of one arm back to the yacht. Once they were back on board, Dan fetched some towels from below deck and wrapped his beautiful bride in them. Shivering and looking as dishevelled as the proverbial drowned rat, he couldn't help but smile. He took her in his arms. "I'm so sorry, Bianca. I shouldn't have rented the boat. I was impatient to show you pleasure of water sports." "Shut up," she said quietly in Dan's ear. "I think I'm cured. I'll never be scared of water again." Dan looked at her in amazement. "What do you mean? I thought this incident would have deterred you from ever going near water again." "Well, no, it didn't, Generoso. The water felt good, and I guess I had to take the plunge to appreciate it." They both laughed. As he and Damianos watched the incident from the pier, Gustavo shook his head. "I can't believe how he can be so thoughtless. He's just a child when it comes to challenges, and the worst part of all this is that he's taken his wife down with him." "I don't think we could conclude that Dan is all at fault in this instance, Gustavo. Bianca is as adventurous as he is, and I would bet that she is somehow pleased to have taken a dip in the ocean." "Really? I would have thought she'd be furious to have Dan sleep in the doghouse for the rest of the journey to Rio Archa." Damianos guffed. "I hardly think Dan would stay in your doghouse for more than a minute, Gustavo. He couldn't bear the idea of being rejected by anyone. He'd rather grovel at his lady's feet and ask for forgiveness than being thrown aside by anyone." "I guess you're right. He likes to have the approval of his entourage as anyone does, but in his case I believe he also needs to show evidence of him being right. He won't back down, I don't think." "You seem to know him pretty well, don't you?" Damianos looked at Gustavo with kindness. "I believe I do, yes. He's not someone you'd easily walk away from, for one thing, and he's so true to himself and his fellow man, you can't ignore him for another." When Bianca stepped up onto the pier, the vessel's owner smiled. "You had to test the water, did you, missus?" "Yes, sure did, sir. It was excellent, by the way. Quite warmer than I expected, in fact." "Could you get us a cab to take us back to our hotel?" Dan asked. "We'll return the towels this afternoon." "Of course, laddie. Just don't go sailing again today. There's a bit of a storm on the way, and I wouldn't even take my yacht out until it passes." "Oh, trust me, sir, I think my wife and I have enough of sailing for a while, but thanks for the advice anyway." The next morning, the couple was on the first train back to London. Bianca looked absolutely radiant. The sun and fresh air had coloured her cheeks with a nice rose hue. "The sea air seems to suit you," Dan remarked as he was admiring the young woman sitting across from him in the train car. "Yes, it does, doesn't it? I feel invigorated. Maybe taking the plunge was good for me in more ways than one." "Perhaps it was." Dan said pensively. I wonder if we should tell your mother about our little escapade. Absolutely. I want to see her face when I tell her that we went sailing. We will omit to tell her that I took a dip, of course, Bianca answered, tittering happily. Are you going to tell Uncle Damianos and Gustavo? Of course, dearest. I wouldn't miss to recount a moment. I mean to tell them everything I should, and the rest will be solely for us to remember.